The wind was not a sound. It was a pressure, a physical weight that tried to peel the skin from his bones. Snow, driven horizontally, was not soft, but a billion tiny needles of ice, scouring the world clean. Silas leaned into it, one hand on Copper's neck, the other shielding his own eyes. The world had vanished into a shrieking, monochrome chaos of white. There was no up, no down, only the gale and the suffocating cold. Copper, his trusted horse, lowered his head and pushed forward, a creature of pure, instinctual will. He trusted Silas, and Silas trusted the work of his own hands. Through the maelstrom, a shape began to resolve itself. It was not a cabin, not a vertical assertion against the sky. It was a low, dark mound, a subtle curve in the landscape, almost invisible against the blizzard's fury. The only thing that truly stood out was the squat, defiant chimney of river stone, a thin wisp of smoke, torn away from its mouth the instant it appeared. It was the shelter. His folly. His ark. He fumbled with the latch on the heavy, cross-braced door, his fingers clumsy with cold. The wind caught the thick wood and tried to rip it from his grasp, but he threw his shoulder against it, shoving it open just enough. He urged Copper forward. The horse, without hesitation, stepped from the screaming apocalypse into a sudden, shocking stillness. Silas followed, pulling the door shut behind him. He threw the heavy iron bolt. The sound of the world ended. It was replaced by a profound, muffled silence, the kind found deep underground. The only noises were the soft crackle of a fire in the stone hearth, the gentle stamp of Copper's hooves on the packed earth floor, and the sound of his own ragged breathing. The air was cool, but not cold. It was still. It was safe. He had made it. The earth held. The arch held. The 100-year wind could have the world outside. 6 months earlier, the world had been green and full of ridicule. Silas had stood in the office of Sheriff Brody, the valley's sole arbiter of law and common sense. A topographical map was spread across the sheriff's desk, held down by a coffee mug and a heavy glass ashtray. Silas's finger, scarred and calloused, traced a line along a low, south-facing slope. "Here," Silas had said, his voice low and even. "It's protected from the north by the granite spine. The drainage is good. The soil is a mix of clay and loam. Stable." Sheriff Brody had leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. He was a big man, accustomed to the simple logic of log walls and pitched roofs. "Stable for what, Silas? For planting potatoes? What are you talking about?" "For a dwelling," Silas replied, meeting the sheriff's gaze without flinching. "I'm not building a cabin. I'm building a dugout, earth-sheltered, a sod roof." Brody had stared at him for a long moment, then let out a short, barking laugh. "A soddy? Silas, this is 1888, not the prehistoric age."
"Men build with timber here. We have sawmills. We have pride. You want to live in a hole in the ground like a badger?" "A badger's home stays warm in the winter and cool in the summer," Silas had stated simply. "A badger's home doesn't get blown over." The sheriff had picked up a pencil, tapping it on the map. "I was a surveyor before I was a lawman. I know this land. A structure needs a proper foundation, Silas. It needs walls that stand on their own. What you're describing is a cave. It'll collapse in the first big melt. It'll be a tomb." Silas had shaken his head slowly. He had seen it before, this confident blindness. He had been a cavalry scout, ranging from the plains of Kansas to the high peaks of the Rockies. He had learned to read a different kind of map, the one written on the land itself. "The trees on the high ridges," he explained. "Look at their north faces. The bark is scoured thin, and the growth rings are compressed. They've been fighting a wind from the north for 100 years, a wind stronger than any we've seen. The Ute elders, they have stories about it. The snow that eats houses. It comes when the sunsets turn the color of a bruise for a month straight." Brody had just sighed, the sound a mix of pity and exasperation. "Silas, with all due respect, you've spent too much time alone out there. People are going to think you're mad." The sheriff's prediction had been an understatement. Within a week, the entire valley of Prospect's Reach knew of Silas's folly. The Mockery was relentless, a constant, low-grade torment. At the general store, men would stop their conversations when he entered, nudging each other. "There's the gopher," one would mutter, loud enough to be heard. "Better watch your step. Wouldn't want to fall into his burrow." Jacob Miller, a farmer who prided himself on the fine new cabin he'd built with milled lumber from the east, had been the most vocal. "A man's home is his castle," he'd declared to the room one afternoon, while Silas was buying nails. "It ought to reach for the sky, not hide from it. What kind of man digs his own grave to live in it?" Silas had paid for his nails, met Miller's smug gaze for a silent second, and walked out. Their words were wind. The real wind was coming, and he had work to do. Their laughter could not insulate a poorly chinked wall. Their pride could not hold up a roof under 4 feet of wet, heavy snow. He let them talk. The work began not with a shovel, but with a plan, refined over years of observation. He did not simply dig a hole. He sculpted the land. He chose the site on the south-facing slope of Whisperwind Ridge with painstaking care. For a week, he did nothing but watch. He watched the sun's path across the sky, marking where the shadows fell. He watched how the water flowed after a summer rain, ensuring the spot he chose would shed moisture naturally, not collect it. He found the place where the earth was a shield, not a trap. The excavation was a partnership between man, beast, and machine. He used a horse-drawn slip scraper, a simple but brutally effective tool. He would guide the handles, digging the steel edge into the soil, while copper, harnessed and steady, would lean into the weight, dragging tons of earth out of the growing hollow. It was grueling, repetitive work under the hot summer sun. Day after day, the pit deepened, a precise rectangle carved into the hillside. It was 15 feet deep at the rear, sloping gently upwards to meet the ground level at the front. The townsfolk who rode by on the valley road would stop and stare, shaking their heads at the sheer scale of the madness. With the earth moved, the true construction began. He started with a foundation, not of concrete, but of the land's own bones. He spent 2 weeks hauling fieldstone from a nearby creek bed, choosing flat, heavy rocks that fit together like pieces of a vast, irregular puzzle. He dry stacked them 3 feet wide, creating a solid base. He did not use modern cement, but a mortar of his own making, a sticky, durable mixture of clay, sand, and fine grass, a technique he'd seen the Pueblo people use for structures that had stood for centuries. The back and side walls were the earth itself, a massive thermal battery. But he knew raw earth could slump and fail, so he reinforced it. He felled dozens of young, straight lodgepole pines from the ridge above. He sharpened their ends, and using a heavy sledgehammer, drove them horizontally deep into the earthen walls, one every 2 feet from top to bottom. They were like steel reinforcing bars, pinning the soil in place, turning a potential weakness into an unyielding strength. It was a hidden architecture, an inner skeleton that no one would ever see, but that would make all the difference. The front wall,
The only part truly exposed to the elements was a fortress. He used the largest logs he could manage, hand-hewing them so they locked together with tight, dovetailed joints. He built not one wall, but two, with a 6-inch gap between them. He spent days gathering dried sphagnum moss and collecting wood ash from his campfires, packing this gap tightly. It was insulation, pure and simple, far more effective than the simple mud and straw chinking his neighbors used. In this wall, he set a single, small window with a pane of glass a full half-inch thick and a doorframe built to hold a door that was more like a castle gate. The roof was the heart of his design, the element that had earned him the most scorn. It was where his knowledge of the plains and the mountains converged. He started by laying 3 massive timber beams, their ends resting on the front log wall and set deep into the earth at the back. Across these, he laid a solid deck of smaller, debarked poles fitted tightly together. This was the structure. Next came the waterproofing. He had traded for a dozen cured buffalo hides, thick and tough. He laid them over the poles, overlapping them like shingles, and then spent a week painting them with hot pine pitch, sealing every seam until the entire surface was a single, black, waterproof membrane. But the real genius was the final layer. He had spent the spring cutting bricks of thick prairie sod from a meadow, stacking them to cure. Now he began to lay them on the roof. The first layer went grass side down, the dense root network knitting together. The second layer went grass side up. He created a living roof, nearly 3 feet thick, composed of soil, roots, and grass. It was heavy, immensely strong, and possessed an incredible insulative power. In the summer, it would stay cool. In the winter, it would catch and hold the snow, using the blizzard's own blanket as a shield against its cold. The final piece of the puzzle was the chimney and its accompanying ventilation system. He built the fireplace first, using his skill as a stonemason. It was not just a box for fire. It was a Rumford-style hearth, with angled sides and a shallow firebox designed to reflect the maximum amount of heat into the room, not up the flue. It was efficient and clean burning. But he knew that in an airtight structure, a fire could consume all the oxygen, and a blocked chimney could fill the space with deadly smoke. His solution was elegant. At the far back of the dugout, he engineered a second, much smaller flue. It was a narrow, stone-lined shaft that ran up through the earth and sod. At its base, inside the shelter, he built a small chamber packed with charcoal and gravel. This was a passive air intake. It would draw fresh air from outside, filtering it and allowing it to enter the shelter low to the ground, feeding the fire and providing breathable air without creating a chilling draft. It was a lung for his house of earth. Inside, he partitioned off a section for copper, creating a warm, dry stall with a packed earth floor that sloped toward a small drainage channel. For himself, he built a simple bunk, a table, and shelves. Then, he began the final, crucial stage: stockpiling. He laid in enough split, seasoned pine and oak to last a year. He hung cured hams and sides of bacon. Sacks of flour, beans, cornmeal, and potatoes were stacked against one wall. 2 large barrels were filled with fresh water from the creek. In Copper's stall, he stacked bale after bale of hay. When he was finished, the shelter was not just a house, it was a self-contained ecosystem, a lifeboat provisioned for the worst storm imaginable. Autumn arrived, painting the aspens on the high slopes in strokes of brilliant gold. The work was done. From the valley road, Silas's folly had all but disappeared, melting into the hillside. It looked like a natural knoll, a barrow from some ancient time, the grass on its roof already greening up after the late summer rains. He rode into Prospect's Reach one last time for salt, coffee, and kerosene. The open Mockery had faded, replaced by a kind of weary pity. The townsfolk saw him as a lost cause, a man so broken by solitude that he preferred to live like an animal. Jacob Miller saw him tying copper to the hitching post outside the store.
"Getting your burrows stocked for the winter, Silas?" Miller asked, a smirk playing on his lips.
"I am," Silas replied, his voice flat, offering no purchase for an argument. "Well, you enjoy your dirt. Me, I'll be enjoying the view from my new glass windows, warm by a proper stove," Miller said, clapping Silas on the shoulder in a gesture of false camaraderie before striding away. Silas paid the gesture no mind. He was watching other things. He saw that the squirrels were not just burying nuts, but were frantically caching them in the deepest parts of hollow logs, far below the likely snow line. He had noticed the flocks of geese had passed overhead a full month earlier than usual, their formations tight and flying with a desperate urgency. The air itself felt different. It was thin and carried a faint, metallic taste on the back of the tongue.
And the sunsets, for a week now, had been just as the Ute stories described. Not beautiful oranges and pinks, but violent, bruised purples and sickening greens, as if the sky itself were unwell. The most reliable sign of all was Copper. The horse grew restless. In his secure stall within the shelter, he would paw at the earth, his ears swiveling constantly, listening to something Silas could not hear. His breathing was heavy, and he would often stare at the heavy barred door as if expecting a monster to crash through it. Silas trusted that animal's sense more than any barometer, more than any man's opinion. The horse knew. Something was wrong. Something was coming. It came on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky, which had been a flat, leaden grey all morning, began to darken rapidly. The temperature plunged. In the space of an hour, it dropped 20 degrees. A strange silence fell over the valley, the kind of absolute stillness that precedes a great violence. Then the first flakes began to fall. They were not gentle flakes, but large, heavy, and wet, plastering the ground in a thick white paste. Then the wind began. It started as a low moan from the north, a whisper through the pines on the ridge. Within minutes, it was a rising howl. Within an hour, it was a physical assault. The temperature continued to plummet, turning the wet snow into fine, abrasive crystals. The 100-year wind had arrived. Inside the earth-sheltered dugout, the world changed. The rising shriek of the gale outside became a distant, muted hum. The shuddering impacts of the gusts against the hillside were felt only as faint, deep vibrations through the soles of his boots. He lit a lantern, its steady yellow glow pushing back the gloom. He built up the fire in the stone hearth, and its warmth began to radiate through the space, a comfortable, enveloping heat. He checked the thermometer he had hung on the wall. Outside, he knew the temperature was falling past 0, then 10 below, then 20. In here, the needle climbed slowly and steadily to 60 degrees and held there. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth, holding the memory of summer's warmth, was now bleeding it back into the shelter, creating a perfect equilibrium with the small, efficient fire. He listened. The only sounds were the fire's cheerful crackle and Copper's contented munching on a flake of hay. The earth held. The arch held. He was safe. He thought of Jacob Miller and his fine cabin with its big glass windows. He knew those windows would be the first to fail, either shattered by the wind or caked in a layer of ice so thick they would bleed every calorie of heat from the room. He thought of the other cabins, their log walls chinked with mud and straw. That chinking would be scoured away by the wind,
leaving 100 tiny holes for the Arctic cold to pour through. They would be burning their firewood at a frantic pace just to stay alive. Their pitched roofs, designed to shed snow, would create massive drifts against their own walls, potentially burying them. Or worse, the sheer weight of the accumulating snow, a foot an hour, would find the weak point in their construction. He felt no satisfaction in these thoughts, only a deep, somber certainty. For 2 days, the storm raged without pause. The world outside ceased to exist. Silas fell into a simple routine: tend the fire, feed and water Copper, eat, sleep. The shelter was a ship navigating a cataclysm, a bubble of calm in the heart of a hurricane of ice. The air remained fresh thanks to his ventilation shaft, and the warmth was constant. On the 3rd day, the wind's constant, high-pitched scream faltered for the first time. It did not stop, but it lessened, dropping to a steady, deep-throated roar. In one of these momentary lulls, he heard it. A sound that did not belong. It was thin and desperate, almost carried away by the gale. A human voice, screaming. He moved to the door, pressing his ear against the thick wood. He heard it again, clearer this time. A cry for help. He unbolted the door. Preparing to go outside was like preparing for a spacewalk. He pulled on his heaviest woolens, his oilskin coat, and a thick fur hat. He took a coil of heavy rope, tying one end securely to an iron ring he had set in the wall beside the door. The other end he tied around his own waist. He would be an anchor to this place of safety. He took a lantern, though he knew its light would be swallowed by the storm. The moment he opened the door, the blizzard tried to force its way in, a snarling beast of wind and snow. He pushed his way out into it, into a world of churning, chest-deep powder. The visibility was less than 10 feet. The wind tore at him, threatening to knock him from his feet. He leaned into it, following the sound. The rope played out behind him, his only connection to survival. He found them less than 200 yards away, though it felt like miles. It was the wreck of Jacob Miller's proud cabin. The roof had collapsed inward under a massive load of snow. Its great ridgepole snapped like a twig. What was left of the walls was splintered and broken. Huddled in the lee of a ruined wall were the Millers. Jacob lay half-conscious, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. His wife, Sarah, was trying to shield their 2 small children with her own body. They were blue with cold, their clothes frozen stiff. Their fire had died hours ago when the chimney collapsed. They looked at Silas as if he were a ghost. Their eyes were wide with shock and disbelief. This was the madman, the gopher, emerging from the earth while the works of sane men lay in ruins around them. "Help us," Sarah Miller sobbed, the words barely audible. Silas didn't speak. Words were useless here. He worked quickly, his movements efficient and sure. He checked Jacob's leg. A bad break, but he was alive. He wrapped the children in the spare blanket he had brought, then lifted the smaller one into his arms. He helped Sarah to her feet, guiding her and her older child toward the faint glow of his shelter, a haven they had never believed in. He went back for Jacob, fashioning a crude sledge from a piece of the broken roof and dragging the injured man across the snow, following his own lifeline back to safety. He brought them inside, into the calm, steady warmth. They stared, dumbfounded. The place they had mocked as a dark, damp hole was a sanctuary. It was clean, dry, and filled with the smell of wood smoke and hay. Copper watched them with large, placid eyes from his stool. Sarah Miller began to cry, not from fear this time, but from a flood of overwhelming relief and shame. We laughed at you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We called you a fool." Silas simply nodded. He handed her a dry blanket from his stores and ladled a mug of hot broth from the pot simmering by the fire. Vengeance was a fool's game. Survival was all that mattered. He set about splinting Jacob's leg with the quiet competence that defined him. He had saved the very people who had scorned him, and in the warm, secure silence of his earthen home, that fact hung in the air, more powerful than any accusation. The storm raged for another full day before it finally broke. On the morning of the 5th day, Silas awoke to a profound and unnerving silence. The wind was gone. He unbolted the door and pushed it open onto a new world. The sun was brilliant, dazzling on a landscape buried under an ocean of snow. The valley of Prospect's Reach was gone, erased. The snow lay in immense, sculpted drifts, 10, 15, 20 feet deep. Here and there, the peak of a roof or the top of a stone chimney poked through, forlorn and lonely. From the direction of the town, he saw only 2 thin plumes of smoke rising into the crisp, painfully cold air. The rest were silent. He emerged into the blinding light, the millers behind him, their faces a mixture of awe and horror. The devastation was absolute. His low, unassuming mound of earth was one of the only structures in the entire valley that was wholly intact, a testament to a wisdom that had been mistaken for madness. Later that day, a small group of figures appeared, struggling through the immense drifts. It was Sheriff Brody and a handful of other survivors from the town. Their faces were gaunt, rimmed with frost, their eyes holding the hollow look of men who had witnessed the end of their world. They had survived by huddling together in the stone-built jailhouse, the only other building to have withstood the storm's fury. Brody saw Silas standing by the entrance to his shelter. He saw the Miller family, alive and safe. He looked at the simple mound of earth and sod, the wisp of smoke curling peacefully from its stone chimney. He walked forward, his exhaustion plain on his face, and stopped before Silas. He took off his hat, a gesture of profound respect. "Silas," the sheriff began, his voice thick with emotion. He swallowed hard. "I was wrong. We all were. We were arrogant fools. We laughed, and the wind took everything. You listened, and you're standing here." He looked past Silas into the warm interior. "How? How did you know?" Silas looked out over the ruined valley, his gaze distant. "It wasn't knowing," he said, his voice quiet. "It was watching. The land told a story. The trees, the animals, the sky. I just paid attention. This," he gestured to the shelter, "isn't magic. It's just logic. The wind can't knock over what it can't get a grip on. The cold can't penetrate 4 feet of earth." The other survivors gathered around, their mockery replaced by a desperate, humbling reverence. They looked at the shelter not as a folly, but as a miracle of foresight. It was not a grave. It was an ark. They asked him to teach them, to show them how he had done it, how they could rebuild, not with pride, but with wisdom. And Silas, a man who had sought only solitude, found himself becoming the foundation of a new community, one forged in the crucible of the great storm. 10 years passed. The Valley of Prospect's Reach lived again, but it was a different place. The memory of the 100-year wind was scarred into the community's soul. The new cabins that dotted the landscape were not the proud, tall structures of before. Many were built differently, following what came to be known as Silas's method. They were built into hillsides with low profiles, reinforced walls, and thick, living roofs of sod and wildflowers. They were homes built to endure, not to impress. Silas's original shelter, the first of its kind, became a local legend. It was known simply as the Hold.
It had become a landmark, a touchstone for the entire valley. In the 2 major blizzards that had followed in the intervening decade, it had served as a communal storm shelter, its warm, steadfast interior saving dozens more lives. Silas himself was no longer the valley eccentric. He was an elder, a man whose quiet words carried more weight than a dozen loud speeches. His vindication was not in the apology he had received, but in the quiet, resilient homes that now stood as a testament to his foresight. The ultimate lesson of Silas's folly was a simple one, learned by the people of Prospect's Reach at a terrible cost. It was that true wisdom is often quiet, unassuming, and found far from the consensus of the crowd. It is written in the rings of a tree, in the flight of a bird, in the color of a winter sunset. What the majority calls madness may simply be a profound truth they are not yet prepared to witness. In his old age, Silas would often sit on a bench outside the Hold on long summer evenings. He would watch the sun set over the rebuilt valley, his hand resting on the neck of a young, strong horse, the great-grandson of his faithful copper. The shelter behind him, once a raw mound of earth, was now covered in a thick carpet of grass and alpine wildflowers, a vibrant, living part of the landscape it had been designed to obey. It was not a monument to a man, but to an idea, that the greatest strength is not in defying nature, but in understanding it.